The Xbox Series S is not as powerful as its big brother, the Series X. Duh. However, as we continue through this current generation, will the Series X become more obsolete sooner than later? Let's take a look. Hey, I'm Sam with Busy Dad Gaming. I help busy dads with all things Xbox so they can relax and go back to their families recharged. Now, a very common question I get with the Series S is, will it become obsolete over the course of this current generation? And it is a valid concern. But when you look at it, the Series S is less powerful, it does have less storage, and it does not have a disk drive. So from that perspective, it's missing some potentially key features for some people. But on paper, feature-wise, the Series S does have the same features as the Series X, but just to a lesser degree. So again, it is a valid question because nobody wants to be left behind. However, the actual answer is a little bit more nuanced, but to be super blunt here for a moment, the Series S will not be left behind, and I'll actually discuss this a little bit further in the video. But let's go ahead and take a look at some of the top reasons why I feel that the Series S will not become obsolete during this current generation. Now to just dive right into things, the first area that I'm going to go after is hardware. And first and foremost, this is one of those generations where you had people in the Xbox One era still rocking the OG Xbox One. Now, even now, although it's not ideal, the Xbox One still can play things like Forza Horizon 5, Halo Infinite, and a lot of these other cross-generational games. That doesn't mean it's the best place to play them, however, but at least you can play them. And if we expand on that a little bit more, you can also play these across the Xbox One S, the One X, and pretty much the entire Xbox One lineup. So these cross-generational games having come out in, the Xbox One was 2013, and here we are in 2022, 9 years later, you're still looking at, well, it's not technically 9 years, but close enough. They're still supporting that particular set of hardware. Even though it's not the best place to play, you can at least still play it. Now, to my point with hardware, what this actually shows is that Microsoft supports that older hardware and is not going to sit there and just let its old hardware get left behind. And that's the Xbox One, not even talking about the Series S here at this point. So the Series S, we can look at it from a perspective of, if Microsoft is supporting the Xbox One from 2013, and we go and look 8 years out into the future, the Series S will most likely still be supported at that point in time. Again, it may change. We may get better streaming. May get better different options. It just really depends. But the Series S, from a hardware perspective, isn't going to be left behind anytime soon. Now, a common concern that I also hear with the Series S is just in terms of performance, and that it potentially would be left behind. And again, this is where we're looking at the Series S coming in from a perspective of, it's a 1080p 120 or even a 1440p at 120, although there's very few games that actually hit that mark. But I intentionally disagree that the performance is going to be left behind, because I feel that there is a fundamental misunderstanding of what is currently being done. Now, to be fair, and as a caveat, I am not a developer, an engineer, or a technical mastermind. If you're looking at things from a PC perspective, PC games have been doing this for years, where you go ahead and you release a game, and it's basically a sliding scale of performance across all the different types of hardware that you can use on that PC. Consoles, it's a little more refined because it's a set of hardware, and you're looking at it, it's just not going to change. So the Series X, the Series S, they have the graphical properties that it can produce, and then you get into the PC realm where it's like umpteen different kind of generational cards across, umpteen NVIDIA, AMD, all these different kind of things. So when you're looking at it from a perspective of that, the games themselves, especially as they make the shift over to just Series X and S games, is going to be using a core code base for those games, which is going to be used across all those different platforms. So the Series X, S, and a PC. Now, the main difference here is that across those different ones is basically just going to use a sliding scale for the graphical performance. So the Series S is going to be the equivalent of like medium settings. Series X is going to be like high settings, and then depending on what kind of PC you have, I have a 3080 in this PC, so I'm going after usually max or ultra settings on this thing. From a sliding scale perspective, that's what you're aiming for, a Series S in this case. It's going to go after medium settings and try to max out those particular frame rates. So 1080p, maybe 1440p, we'll have to see how this goes. This is one of those things from a performance standpoint where it just makes it much easier for the developers to go ahead and build for just one thing and then scale that across the different platforms that it's going to be using against, as opposed to going off PlayStation and doing a Switch port and then doing a PC and then doing an Xbox. You're having all these different ports and code bases. It can make it very difficult. And the last reason I feel the Series S is not going to be left behind in this generation is just game streaming. it just extends the overall hardware's capability over time. When you're looking at the Xbox One, for example, you can go ahead and stream Xbox Series X level graphics on your Xbox One, which is pretty awesome. But again, there are limitations as it stands today, and those are just things to keep in mind, and that technology is going to get better over time. I don't see this being a near-term play. I see this being more of a long-term play, especially as game streaming actually matures and it just becomes a better technology overall. And this also brings me to another point within game streaming, is that Microsoft is playing a much more nuanced game here, because you have the physical consoles, and in this case, you have the Xbox One and then the Series console generations. They're making games where you're actually going to be playing them. So, for example, game streaming, they're trying to get them onto TVs and put the apps on those particular TVs. So then you can start playing them through your Samsung or your LG or whatever. Then you have your consoles that you can go ahead and start streaming through. They're essentially building an ecosystem where you can play your games on whatever device that you particularly have, whether it's a TV or a tablet or a phone or your console, whatever the case ends up being. So what this really does is it extends the overall life cycle of the generation, especially if you bought hardware on that particular generation. Now, coming at this from a dad's perspective, it just really does come down to value. And the price point of the Series S is really hard to beat at $299 here in the States. And I don't really see that dropping anytime soon, but I do see them bundling it in different ways. So like, for example, I've seen it bundled with things from like Fortnite or Rocket League or different things of that nature. So I don't see a price drop happening, but the value of the box itself as it stands right now is really hard to beat. The other piece from a dad's perspective is the overall demand. The Series X is pretty hard to get right now, just from an availability standpoint, and the Series S is more available. And the reason being is because Microsoft recognizes that the Series S is aimed at the mainstream market. And I surmise over the course of this generation, with all things being equal, the Series X and the Series S, if made available at the same time, I feel the Series S will end up outselling the Series X, just because of the market it's going after. The Series S is really just aimed at value and delivering as much value as possible at the lowest price point possible, and making it to where if you have huge amounts of people with a Series S, just from an economical standpoint, it doesn't make sense for Microsoft to no longer support it over time and just let it fall by the wayside. Now, the real caveat here ends up coming in with the third-party support, because when it comes to third parties, especially so far in this first year of the Series generation, the Series S hasn't been supported a lot. So when I did my review on Guardians of the Galaxy, for example, the game itself on the Series S was just meh. It didn't have a ton of features compared to its Series X competitor, and it just didn't, I mean, it was just okay. Personally speaking, it was just at 1080, 30 frames per second. And so it wasn't something that I would write home about. Series X version, at 60 frames per second looked fantastic. And I'm not the biggest fan of 30 frames per second when you're at 4K and doing some of the flashy stuff, but the Series S wasn't as good as optimized as it probably could have been. So those are the kind of things that you're going to be looking at with the Series X. I don't see it being, left behind. I do see it being an option where the overall technology, especially when it comes to game streaming, and that ends up maturing. Again, not very good for first-person shooters or like driving or anything Twitch related right now, but as the technology starts to mature and it starts to get better, I do foresee that getting a little bit better. As we go through this current generation, again, I do not see the Series S being left behind, but do I feel that there's going to be a Series S revision? Yes, most likely. In those kind of revisions, I can see them adding more storage, for example, because 512 is not all that great. I could also see them probably doing some kind of spec bump in terms of, increasing the voltage on the CPU or improving the graphic throughput a little bit. Little things like that, kind of like what they did with the revisions on the Xbox One. But overall, the Series S will be supported through this generation. I have no doubts there. It's not something that's going to become obsolete anytime soon. And if you're unsure of what monitor or TV to actually use with your Series S or X, make sure to check out the video that is going over those TVs and monitors that are going to be the best fit for you. And I'll see you out there.